China this last summer. So please come to that. That's in room 305 on Wednesday. And then also on Wednesday, my theory and practice in historic preservation seminar that meets Wednesday evenings, 6 to 8:30. If you're interested in preservation and wanted to join the class and Professor Kingston Heath for a more general discussion about the future of historic preservation, jobs in historic preservation, etc., please feel free to come to this. It's in one of the 220s upstairs here. I can't remember B or C. C? Okay. Good. So welcome everyone to the Kelly Tukee Lecture in Historic Preservation for this year. Tonight's guest is Dr. Kingston Heath. He's a professor and the director emeritus of the graduate program in historic preservation at the University of Oregon. Professor Heath holds a master's in art history from the University of Chicago, and then a master's in Ph.D. in American Studies from Brown University. For the last 15 years, he's been the director of the very successful and innovative preservation program at Oregon, which among many offerings includes the Pacific Northwest Field School, field studies in Croatia, and emphases on sustainability and vernacular theory. His most recent book is Vernacular Architecture and Regional Design, which is by Routledge. I looked today, it's out of print on Amazon, so that's always good for an academic book, but I'm sure it'll be available again. Good. Kingston Heath is a native of New Bedford, Massachusetts, which is his topic tonight. His previous written work on the city includes the Patina of Place, the cultural weathering of the New England industrial landscape. This book won the Abboud Cummings, which is the best book award from the Vernacular Architecture Forum. Another piece here, the Howland Mill Village, a missing chapter in model workers' housing. From Old Time New England, the Journal for the Society for the Preservation of New England Antiquities. This one won the Catherine Bauer Worcester Prize for Best Scholarly Article from the Society for American City and Regional Planning History. Most recently, he was the contributing editor for a double theme issue of the journal Industrial Archaeology on the topic of industry change and cultural identity in New Bedford. So there'll be also a reception outside after the talk, but please join me in welcoming Dr. Kingston Heath.
Thank you, Andy, and all of you for coming here today. I didn't get mic'd, so I'm going to have to be like Elvis in the 1968 Christmas special, where he had to do all of his songs sitting down in a chair. So I apologize for not being able to be more animated. I do want to thank Shelley Miller for helping to organize my getting here, and Sarah and, was it Tracy? Rachel, for getting all the technical material together. I was fortunate to have a nice tour this afternoon with Richard Guy Wilson, and during the discussion, he was saying that Jefferson hit kind of an impasse as to how to treat each of the pavilions, and that it was always a good idea to go to informed individuals to get information. And so he went to Thornton and he went to Latrobe. So first of all, I had to talk about Jefferson if I was going to be here. And secondly, I wanted to thank some of the people who informed me. Dr. Patrick Malone. Malone is a professor emeritus at Brown University in American Civilization and Urban Studies Department. Michael Steinitz is the Deputy State Historic Preservation Officer and Director of Preservation Planning Division at Massachusetts Historical Commission. and Robert Melnick, who is the Professor Emeritus of Landscape Architecture, who provided me with comments on this paper today. I'm kind of interested, before I begin, with getting a sense of who my audience is and where you come from in terms of your disciplines. I assume, how many of you are from architecture? I think the studio's out there. Look at that. All right, great. Well, I hope you'll find something worthwhile here. How about historic preservation? All sitting together with Mark over here. Okay, great. Any American Studies people? We couldn't tantalize the, oh, they're here. Okay. Landscape architecture? Good. Planning? All right. Anybody who is from a different discipline? Yes. What?
I'm staff.
Staff. You have no discipline. More ways than one, right? Okay, let me begin because I know there's a nice reception afterward. All right. Let's see. May I have the lights? My talk, as you see on the board, is the nostalgic and authentic narratives of place, the Yankee and the Immigrant in a New England port city. The recent presidential election has drawn attention to the transformation of many regions of our country that have been abandoned by corporate capital over the years. Efforts to retain or return manufacturing to those locales involve many complex factors. While Germany still relies on manufacturing for 20% of its income base, the United States relies on only 8%. For many affected areas, all that will remain for its inhabitants is the dignity that comes with honoring the legacy of labor. But how will that story be told? Today, I'm here to talk about a city. Though the city's history represents two regionally distinct industries among the many that flourished and failed when America was the industrial power in the world, today's presentation helps to illuminate a significant overarching question that is applicable to many former industrial centers. Once a city's period of celebrated prosperity has passed, what is the responsibility of heritage stewards in defining the distinction between nostalgic and authentic narratives of place? New Bedford, Massachusetts may provide a compelling case study. Okay. Rachel?
Yeah, if it's not working, you can just hit the space bar.
Down below? Okay, you better point me in the right direction. I don't know why this isn't working. This always works for me.
Any thoughts?
Is that piece not in there?
Plug it in again one more time, see what happens. And escape out of that.
Yes.
See how important staff is. New Bedford is situated on the southeastern coast of Massachusetts. The city's location along the Acushnet River near its outlet to Buzzards Bay anchored her earliest economic, social, and historical identities to the sea. From approximately 1818 to 1928, the expressive character and regional economies of New Bedford were linked inextricably, first to whaling and then to textiles. Over the years, New Bedford's whaling history has been celebrated in film, fiction, public art, and in both popular and scholarly nonfiction. Even after the decline in whaling and the rise of New Bedford as a major textile center, it eventually chose to identify itself exclusively as the whaling city, situating the public imagination on its maritime past, while purposefully ignoring the less romantic but no less significant textile developments that followed in its wake. New Bedford's historical amnesia related to its textile era may have been a result of the economic upheaval felt so emphatically as textile mills all over New England closed or moved to the South, most notably after 1928. The loss of this once thriving industry brought years of economic decline and wrenching hardship to New Bedford citizens that many were eager to forget. I would suggest a more provocative theory, however. By the turn of the 20th century, 97% of the textile workforce in New Bedford was of foreign extraction, living in crowded mill districts. The city was uncomfortable with acknowledging the immigrant workforce that it had used to fuel its industries. It was not a history that cultural arbiters wanted to celebrate. Those entrusted with the city's historical narrative as part of its evolving cultural tourist efforts chose to ignore the cultural reality, bringing with it the loss of historical record of exceptional technological achievement and the denial of a cultural heritage that was shaped in large part by the era of textile dominance. For their part, New Bedford would always remain the whaling city and home to early Yankee, that is, native-born mariners. To probe the issue of how a city chooses to present itself to its local citizens and outsiders alike, I would like to address the complex attachment between people and landscapes by focusing on such topics as the experienced and constructed and imagined identities of place. For example, some residents who grew up in the city as I did see New Bedford's heritage as embodied principally in neighborhoods comprised of its most visible vernacular resource, three-decker rental flats. Located primarily at the north and south ends of the city, these canyons of wood frame multifamily housing units often terminated in the urban spectacle of an enormous mill complex. Such prodigious mills, strategically placed in convenient walking distance to the shops, provided the means of support to the majority of local residents. Between 1846 and 1928, New Bedford's 70 textile mills provided the lifeblood to their adjacent neighborhoods, and as such hold meaning for longtime residents who still attach their identity to the mills and their associated housing. These experience-based recollections later become part of the memory framework that constitutes one's awareness of and attachment to place. Such memory frameworks are temporary, however. This is why the loss of the technological heritage of the mills is so critical to consider. When we erase physical manifestations of cultural memory, we lose meaning and attachment. Here are the remaining bones and bricks of the 1906 annex of the same Dartmouth mill shown in the previous image that I photographed just 2 years ago. Visitors to New Bedford, on the other hand, generally see the city through the lens of its promoted heritage, the Seaman's Bethel, or Mariner's Chapel, as Melville referred to it in Moby Dick. That's shown at the bottom left. The New Bedford Whaling Museum, the few remaining remnants of former sail-offs, candleworks, and the patrician houses of the whaling families. In this instance, place is consciously constructed through public art, museum installations, National Register designations, literary fiction, even commemorative tourist markers that shape what cultural geographer Edward Ralph in Place and Placelessness terms the consensus identity of place. In the case of New Bedford, it cultivates the popular fascination with the exotic aspects of maritime life in a bygone age, stressing the individuality that separates New Bedford from other cities and promoting the engagement with the city of a romantic, largely imagined past. While the buildings and objects showcased are generally authentic, too often presentations of the city offer a sanitized, distant, and consumable past that edits out aspects of a locale that are perceived as more complex or emotionally unsettling. Such is often the case when a community turns to cultural tourism for economic revitalization and is faced with the dilemma of embracing romantic convention over realistic representation. This is not to suggest that New Bedford does not have a whaling heritage worthy of celebration within the canon of maritime history. Indeed, it has. But the city's efforts to interpret, list, and promote maritime heritage at the expense of its cotton manufacturing past offer contrasting visions of place attachment and convey a highly selective story of how people lived in their lives in two sequential and prosperous eras of New Bedford urban development. To a certain degree, this is understandable when a city has lost its economic potency and searches for relevance in today's world. As John Dixon Hunt suggests in his editorial essay in the theme issue on nostalgia and change over time, quote, "Loss is a human condition, and learning to confront it, nostalgia may play a vital role," end quote. But dominant stories of place confer power and determine whose stories get to be told, sanctioned, and studied, and whose do not. Graduate student Wm. Al-Abdullah puts it succinctly in her comment to UVA's Historic Preservation discussion page. She writes, "Commodification of the past of a certain group leads to social injustice by creating social exclusivity. What is needed," she continues, "is a fuller sense of the past, one that focuses on all classes and all histories," end quote. Another factor plays into such historical bias. In truth, the industrial vernacular receives little scholarly attention today beyond the specialized fields of study. Yet industrial landscapes often constituted large geographic areas that supported, in most cases, remarkably diverse populations. Though often clouded by labor issues and significant environmental harm, their developments nevertheless reshaped not only the natural settings where they were located, but a significant part of the American way of life. The goal is not to praise industrial development per se, but to understand its role in shaping the lifeways of a people and the regional identity it spawned in a particular place in time. In this regard, American Studies and Historic Preservation programs could do more to address this aspect of American culture. And with Andy here, I'm sure it will. New Bedford's dominant historical narrative. New Bedford's maritime history established the foundation of the city's first industrial development, refining sperm oil and whale oil fuel. By the mid-19th century, New Bedford was in essence a single economy based entirely on whaling and its related industries. This was a pattern of economic development that mill owner Joseph Grinnell later referred to as intelligent specialization. Local bankers and whaling merchants funded the construction of ships that returned from 3 to 4 year voyages with barrels of raw whale products that became the basis of New Bedford's local industries. In today's parlance, New Bedford was an oil town. By 1850, New Bedford was the largest whaling port in the world and one of the richest cities per capita in the country. Ships in port formed forests of mastheads that stood out against the skyline. Docks were choked with casks of raw oil as they awaited transport by horse-drawn wagons called drays to the oil factories for processing. The banks of New Bedford's harbor were lined with these oil factories, emitting the smoke and smells of the oil refining industry that defined the land-based component of whaling. As Mark Foster recounts in his award-winning article in IA on New Bedford, 30 oil factories and candle houses built between 1768 and 1927 refined the raw materials collected by its whalers, producing sperm oil and whale oil fuels, spermaceti candles, and various forms of industrial lubricants. The city's motto, Lucum Defundo, confidently stated, "I pour forth light." And that is indeed what it did. These products were in high demand and were shipped all over the world to illuminate homes and workplaces. Thus, it is appropriate to view whaling as a critical component of the Industrial Revolution and as an illustration of how the consumption of sperm oil and spermaceti candles as illuminants became associated with the ideal of American middle-class life. It is also important to recognize whaling as a pivotal component in the transforming of lighting in American society. As such, whaling was at the center of life in New Bedford. The city's prosperity was concentrated largely in the hands of shrewd Quaker and after 1830 Unitarian and congregational businessmen who invested not only in whaling ships but in associated industries such as cordage factories, shipbuilding, copper sheathing to line the hulls of ships, oil refineries, candle works, wicking mills for spermaceti candles, and interlocking industries such as banking and insurance offices to cover marine risks. An almost invisible but critical part of New Bedford's whaling industry was the roughly 10,000 crewmen who manned its whalers. These men were at sea for years at a time and had few families living in port. Their brief time on shore was concentrated principally among the rooming houses, saloons, and brothels, strategically situated near the working-class shopping district or along the wharf thoroughfares such as Bethel Street. Locals once referred to it as Brothel Street. Catherine Grover cites a report from 1852 that listed 78 liquor shops and 56 houses of ill repute, serving a city of only 20,000 people. This squalid area of boarding houses and brothels along Bethel Street was destroyed around 1913 to make way for the new whaling museum, shown at the bottom right, putting forth a cleansed perception of only one aspect of the whaling industry that brought the city fame and fortune, the whaling hunt and its associated material culture. In contrast to life along Bethel Street, the most prosperous whaling merchants early on moved far from the offending noises and smells and relocated to the hill, as land along County Road west of the city was called. Here, New Bedford's elite families, all related by birth, marriage, and or business, were as bound together in the proximity of their peaceful suburban estates as they were in their financial destinies. Given the preponderance of New Bedford's involvement in the whaling industry, the appearance of the Wamsutta Mill on Front Street in 1846 must have appeared as an inconsequential interloper at this particular time. In hindsight, it would portend the future direction of the city's finances, for this embryonic industry came at a time of dynamic social and economic change within the city as well as beyond its borders. At the height of the whale fishery in New Bedford in 1857, the industry boasted a fleet of 417 whalers that produced over 56,000 barrels of sperm oil and 153,000 barrels of whale oil. Unfortunately, that same year, what happened in 1857? Any of you with economic backgrounds? 1857, again in 1871, again in 1893, again in 1929. Economic depression. So the panic of 1857 led to a significant drop in demand, resulting in a glut in the market and declining prices. New Bedford investors reeled as whale oil dropped from 80 cents a gallon to 64 cents, resulting in hundreds of barrels of oil sitting on the wharves awaiting market recovery. We just think about oil shortages today and the fluctuation of the market, but it happened in mid-19th century as well. It should be noted that sperm oil, as opposed to whale oil, was the most expensive fuel and best illuminant available at the time. As such, it was used almost exclusively by the federal government for its lighthouses and by the most exclusive residences. Likewise, a spermaceti candle burned twice as long and twice as bright as a conventional paraffin candle of the time. It too was expensive, since the solid, waxy substance found in the head case of a sperm whale, seen at the left, took from fall to the next summer to press repeatedly, congeal, and be formed into candles. How many of you saw In the Heart of the Sea that came out just about a year ago? Any of you? The Ron Howard documentary on whaling? Oh, it's great. It takes place in 1820 when the ship, the Essex, was sunk by a huge whale that gave the precedent for Moby Dick, that Melville went out to whaling in 1840 on the Acushnet, left for Fairhaven, just opposite New Bedford. There's an interesting scene in there when you go and rent it, of this young cabin boy who was mouthing off, and his older crew members tossed him into the head case of a sperm whale, into the murky fluid of spermaceti. Smelly, sticky, and he was complaining. And they said, "Lad, you were amidst pure gold," because spermaceti was worth so much. And when they came back into port and they were getting shares of whether, maybe 1/25th, they were harpooner, maybe 1/125th, like Melville if he was a green hand, this meant money in their pockets. So when we talk about these things being processed, it seems like we're in the sanitized industry, when in fact it was dirty and smelly and not a fun place to be, which is why Melville jumped ship just after the first year instead of 4 years on a whale ship. Rent it, it's worth seeing. The search for less expensive illuminants was about to be realized, and New Bedford whale oil business was the principal market affected. By the time George Bissell and his Pennsylvania Rock Oil Company investors launched their venture into petroleum in 1859, kerosene, a cheaper form of illuminating oil, was already available in small quantities in the U.S. from foreign markets. The availability of petroleum products and the development of improved lamp technology soon made less expensive illumination options available and spelled the gradual demise of whale products used for that purpose. Local competition was immediately evident, even in this whale oil capital. The 1860 United States Manufacturing Census, you don't normally use that as a resource, but I stumbled across it in one of the antique stores in Oregon. It was undertaken by the Department of Interior and listed 14 kerosene oil establishments in Bristol County, Massachusetts. New Bedford was its county seat, so right in the home of whale oil processing, you were seeing ambitious folks already moving to the competitive kerosene. However, there was still a strong market for baleen products, otherwise known as whalebone. Whalebone was a misleading term for baleen, the massive plates of cartilage in the whale's jaw used to strain food from the ocean. Products generated from those toothless baleen whales, such as the Arctic bowhead whale, continued to serve the American marketplace into the 1920s. Because it was strong and flexible, it was used for fishing rods, shoe horns, brushes, umbrella ribs, buggy whip handles, corset stays, and other items that eventually were replaced by plastic goods. We forget how much of our world was shaped by our dependence on organic materials well into the 20th century. As whales in the Atlantic decreased in number, much of New Bedford's fleet gradually moved to the Pacific to engage in Arctic whaling. The Arctic, however, held dangerous waters previously avoided by the whaling industry, and many losses in New Bedford ships and cargoes resulted in 1871 and again in 1875 by being trapped in the ice, as illustrated in Harper's Weekly. It became clear to New Bedford investors that the days of Jonathan Bourne's ship, the Lagoda, grossing more than $6 an hour for the entire 4-year voyage, were over. Whaling was no longer yielding high profits with limited risks to investors. The 6 to 8% dividends available in textiles became appealing. The ignored historical narrative. It was common knowledge among New Bedford's business community that Wamsutta Mills had been a successful business venture for its local investors, realizing by 1874 300% profit from its original capital investment. By the 1880s, with a continued contraction of profitability in whaling, the city's business interests moved seamlessly into textiles, since many of those involved with the whaling industry now invested in textiles. With this robust development of textile manufacturing in the city, the shoreline of New Bedford rapidly took on the palette of red brick that after 1869 marked the line of new mills along the northern and southern reaches of the Acushnet River. Previously, mills were constructed of local granite. The visual cadence of smokestack after smokestack, necessary for the draft of steam-powered mills, separated these mills from the earlier water-powered mills built along New England's working rivers and falls. New Bedford stands as a prime example of the effect that steam power had on the industrialization of a former colonial port city. In fact, New Bedford reached iconic status in its industrial exploitation of steam power. One of the most significant engineers of the day, George Corliss, was famous for the huge steam engines that he built to power the exhibits in the manufacturing hall at the Centennial Exhibit in Philadelphia. Few people outside the industry were aware, however, that Corliss had built even larger engines earlier to power Wamsutta's Mill No. 4 of 1870 and Mill No. 5, 1875. Corliss's firm was located in nearby Providence, Rhode Island. According to Patrick Malone, the steam engine for Wamsutta Mill No. 4 was for a brief period the largest and most powerful mill engine in the world. This technological marvel greatly improved the efficiency of Wamsutta's newest mills and set new standards in the industry. But why choose steam power in the first place? New Bedford's coastal location meant that its mills benefited from the lower cost of coal. That was at least $1 per ton cheaper when delivered to the waterfront than when delivered to inland textile centers that were dependent solely on rail shipments. Another factor determined the ultimate success of the industry. New Bedford had unique natural advantages described in 1892 as, quote, a certain dampness and softness in the atmosphere that allowed cotton threads to be spun without breaking, end quote. Prior to the introduction of technologies that address heating, cooling, and humidity factors in the southern mills, northern factories had a regional environmental advantage. As New Bedford entered the 1890s, 21 cotton mills extended along the waterfront, laying claim to what just 20 years earlier was a shoreline dominated by whaling vessels. Together, mills, mill housing, and immigrant labor began to transform the face of the city. One source notes that in 1889, 2,600 operatives employed by Wamsutta Mills were, quote, principally English, Scotch, Irish, and French Canadian, with a slight sprinkling of Americans and a few other nationalities, end quote. Immigrant workers such as skilled spinners recruited from Lancashire, England, shown here, were critical to the city's niche market of fine woven goods, known far and wide for its high thread count shirts and sheetings. A second and more robust phase of textile manufacturing in the city began in 1901 with the economic recovery following the Panic of 1893, the crippling strike of 1898, and the abundant mill failures of that year. Now reorganized and often consolidated with other industries, these new mills were almost entirely funded by outside investors, whereas interlocking local business interests controlled the earlier phase of the industry. In response to these new mill starts and the subsequent demand for labor, other ethnic groups began to flock to New Bedford. Upon their arrival, they saw dark clouds of smoke belching forth from coal-fed factories. This site, while emblematic of industrial pollution today, signaled to the new arrivals a manufacturing center working at full capacity and commensurately the promise of employment. Better equipped, larger, and more efficient mills became the rule. In this frantic exploitation of the moment, the goal of these outside investors was to maximize profit. It was textile production taken to the extreme. The 1909 Nashawina Mill, shown here for example, claimed that it had the largest weave room in the world, covering the floor space of 6 acres under one roof. With the more efficient looms such as the 1894 Model A Draper automatic loom that provided automatic bobbin replacement and advancements in ring spinning machinery, lower skill operatives joined the New Bedford workforce in greater numbers, thus reducing the industry's reliance on better paid, skilled union workers. In 1900, French Canadians comprised 40% of all the mill operatives, about half of whom were now female workers. While the labor class represented by seamen on whaling vessels constituted essentially a non-resident textile workforce, new resident labor class in the city's numbers, in contrast to that of the whaling population, were astronomical. Between 1880 and 1910, New Bedford underwent a 300% increase in population, due almost solely to the expansion of the city's newest industries. By 1911, New Bedford had a population of 104,067 textile mills, leading the country in the value of fine cotton goods. By this point, the neighboring cities of New Bedford and Fall River, Massachusetts, formed a major urbanized belt in the southern part of the state that exceeded in production capacity and spindles those along the Merrimack River, where Lowell mills were located. With 97% of New Bedford's textile workers comprised of first or second generation immigrants, by the turn of the 20th century, the textile mill districts in New Bedford became synonymous with immigrant labor. Between 1908 and 1913, for example, over 1,000 three-family rental flats were built to house the workers hired to meet the labor demands of the city's newest mills. 290 were built in 1910 alone, as you see here with the arrow. The overwhelming presence of textile mills in their housing correlate, the three-decker flat, meant that New Bedford fully expressed the forces of industrial capitalism. This was no longer a whaling city. Statements to the contrary would be at odds with the overt visual evidence upon entering the city. Yet prior to the publication of my book in 2001, The Patina of Place, there was never a mention of three-decker flats in the local architectural studies, and there are still no historic districts in New Bedford designating the relevance of this omnipresent building stock. Against the backdrop of visible explosion of mill buildings, multifamily rental flats, and the demographic shift among the industry's workforce, civic leaders began to cultivate nostalgia and to manipulate the city's public image by installing maritime paintings in its new library and funding a new museum in 1913 that depicted New Bedford as a whaling community rather than the textile urban center it had become. The same year that New Bedford Whaling Museum was underway, the bronze sculpture of the whaleman was presented to the city by William W. Crapo. The freestanding sculpture was situated prominently outside the newly refurbished New Bedford Free Public Library of 1910. Interesting here is the fact that at this juncture, William W. Crapo was the president of Wamsutta Mills, Potomska Mills, and the Acushnet Mills Corporation. Yet he chose to pay tribute to New Bedford's bygone whaling days. In the visual retelling of the city's whaling heritage, license was taken. Despite the fact that after the 1860s, harpooners were generally Native Americans, African Americans, Cape Verdeans, West Indians, or Pacific Islanders, the harpooner depicted in the whaleman statue exhibited striking Caucasian features and a classical mode of representation. In one respect, this is not surprising, given the fact that the sculptor, Bella Pratt, was a former assistant to Augustus St. Gaudens. But this aesthetic decision was controversial on other grounds. According to copies of the correspondence related to the speeches of the day, both Pratt and Crapo had been advised to use as their model a brava from the Cape Verde island of Brava off of the African coast, since bravas were the principal whalers of the day. Follow-up discussions steered the characterization of the model to an earlier period. The whaleman to be represented in the statue was, quote, to typify the early Yankee curds that sent New Bedford sailors across all the oceans of the sea, spearing cetaceans for oil, end quote. So the sculptor was asked to find a boat steer of the old type, basically one consistent with the image of native-born New Englanders. Clearly, there were public sentiments that whaling business had changed. A photograph in the 1907 New Bedford Mercury 100th Anniversary Edition offered a telling caption: "The passing type of whaleman and the new, the Yankee and the Cape Verder." In the commemoration of the whaling era, what was put forth was a romanticized view of the way the industry would like to be remembered. In doing so, it overlooked not only the high level of diversity within the whaling industry, but the harsh underbelly of such practices that severely exploited the whalemen in the areas of food and finance, where in some cases, whalemen returning after several years at sea actually owed money to the ship's store. For further background, see Robert Johnson's essay in that theme issue in IA. Instead, it stressed the cult of masculinity that pitted men against the monsters of the sea. It also chose to omit the reality that these whaling vessels were essentially floating slaughterhouses, severely reducing the world's whale population, a recognition currently being expressed by the New Bedford Whaling Museum. Hence, in the commemorative statue of the whaleman, one may view public art as functioning simultaneously as a statement of regional heritage and prestige, and as an agent of illusion and myth. This dominant narrative not only stressed an imagined past in many depictions of whaling, it denied the critical role of immigrant wage earners of both the whaling and textile industries that fueled the city's prosperity. As Joseph A. Conforti notes in his important book, Imagining New England, this pattern was true of other New England towns and cities as a result of the urban, industrial, and ethnic transformation of much of the region following the Civil War. It is during the ensuing decades, Conforti contends, that the, quote, reinvention of the Yankee, end quote, as he put it, took root, shaped our conception of New England's regional character, influenced public policy, and contributed to the rise of the nostalgic colonial revival movement, including what Thomas Denenberg refers to as Wallace Nutting's moralizing visual inventions of old New England home life. New Bedford's celebration of the Yankee whaleman, therefore, should be seen within the cultural context of a time when concerns about the large numbers of foreign workers in the U.S. led to such reactionary developments as the Americanization movement, begun earlier but given official sanction in July 4th, 1915. A series of federal anti-immigration acts followed as well. The most dramatic was the Johnson Act, also known as the 1924 Immigration Act, with its national origin quota system formula. The rampant industrialization development of New Bedford's mills, 70 by 1923 as opposed to only 21 in 1890, was a vivid daily reminder of the city's evolved identity. This industrial explosion in cotton and wool manufacturing, and later silk and rayon as well, dramatically transformed the comfortable image of mid-19th century maritime village life, comprised of patrician houses and cultivated gardens that long-time native-born inhabitants remembered, to one of mills, tenements, and foreign workers. For the city's elite, New Bedford's public identity increasingly focused around the center of the city, where their business interests, public buildings, estates, and early cultural heritage resided. In doing so, they effectively cast a blind eye to the textile industrial precincts that surrounded it. And oddly, these individuals even resisted promoting this very profitable aspect of the city that many had invested in to the public at large. In fact, New Bedford Mayor H.B. Remington was concerned that the city's prominence as a national leader in the textile industry had not been made evident enough because the city's public image continued to be tied too closely, as he put it, quote, to her grand old whaling days. The September 14, 1924 headline in the Evening Standard read, "Soft pedal on whaling days for a time," says Mayor. "Need of boosting New Bedford as a live manufacturing center of quality goods rather than as a home of picturesque but defunct whale ships." Part of his solution to promote the city's textile achievements was to revise his failed 1909 proposal for a common trademark to be placed on all New Bedford cotton goods. The branding logo stated, "Made in New Bedford, Massachusetts," First in America for fine fabrics, manufactures a mile a minute, New Bedford products lead the world. The ongoing reimagining of the city's whaling heritage was clearly frustrating to Mayor Remington, who was attempting to fend off growing concerns about a regional textile depression, being felt as early as 1922 in the region and in full force in New Bedford by 1925. It is perhaps worth noting that the film Down to the Sea in Ships was filmed on location in New Bedford at this very moment, claiming that it was the greatest film since Birth of a Nation, perhaps not the best example. It heroically chronicled the city's whaling practices with important live footage taken at the end of the whaling era. While many were comfortable basking in the fading glory, trouble was brewing elsewhere. New Bedford entered the textile field relatively late in New England and thus benefited from the technological improvements in the niche industry of fine woven goods that made their new mills extremely competitive. The South had a parallel entry into textile production, beginning most notably in the 1840s, as did New Bedford, but operated on a small scale at first. As a result, New Bedford seemed immune to the so-called Southern menace. Coarse-grade textiles, meaning coarse or medium fine yarn count, designed for utility goods such as flour sacks and loose smoking tobacco pouches, required relatively slight skill and could be carried out in small plants that limited capital investment, as some of us witnessed at VAF Durham 2 years ago. The South captured the market for coarse-grade textiles by 1900, fostered in part by the introduction of the less costly hydroelectric power. As World War I approached, government orders for coarse goods, such as cord tires and military uniforms, prompted a change in the local industry. New Bedford began to compete directly with the South for military contracts. Wartime prosperity was short-lived, however, and 1920 was a disastrous year for New Bedford textile workers and mill management alike, as it was for other industries nationally. This pattern of decline continued through the ensuing years. The transformation of national leadership in the textile industry from New England to the South was staggering. In 1880, 80% of the active spindles were concentrated in New England. By 1939, 72% of the active spindles in the U.S. were located in the South, compared with only 24% in 1900. So this is your heritage issue as well. As a result, many of New Bedford's textile companies moved to the South or closed. You might know Wamsutta Mills, known for their percale sheets, Hathaway Mills, known for their shirts, and Beacon Mills, known for their wonderful blankets. These were among those that moved. Regional wage differences. Some figures state as much as 40%. The new demands for working longer shifts due to the absence of labor unions in most of the southern mills. New developments in technology, such as the latest ring spinning machinery shown here, that could be operated even by children, a concern of social reformers in both the North and South, and new infrastructure that addressed humidity issues and temperature regulators in the spinning rooms were significant factors being addressed by New Bedford mill owners as they reconsidered their business prospects. So we've gone from skilled union workers to immigrant wage earners, to women, to now children, and in many cases in the new mills, automation. A 1923 engineering survey on New Bedford, undertaken by a New York engineering firm, voiced a concern that despite its evident successes to date, New Bedford was, quote, perilously near being a one-industry city, end quote. At this juncture, 82% of the city's workforce was employed solely in textiles. When the New England textile depression hit New Bedford by 1925, the intelligent specialization of its one-industry economy lacked the resilience to evolve. Between 1928 and 1933, 21 mills were closed. In 1933 alone, the city lost 7 of its remaining 42 textile mills, putting 5,000 operatives out of work. While similar conditions existed elsewhere in New England, as well as the rest of the nation during the Depression, the 1937 census indicates that the percentage of gainful workers unemployed in the U.S. was 16.1%. Throughout Massachusetts, 18.1%. In New Bedford, a staggering 32.3% were unemployed. Only about half of the remaining yarn and weaving mills were in operation in 1944, and nearly all were gone by 1959, or transformed into garment shops or discount stores. Where once New Bedford civic leaders spoke of their city in superlatives, the largest whaling port in the world, or the national leader in fine woven goods, quiet desperation replaced bravado. The textile industry that by the 1880s had so completely governed the life and character of New Bedford was never to recover. Never again would the city experience the gritty vibrancy of 70 textile mills, signaling their productive potency in clouds of smoke from coal-fed boiler houses. New Bedford citizens can be proud, though, that when the city did compete on the national stage, as Mayor Remington's trademark boasted, New Bedford was first in America for fine fabrics, manufactured a mile a minute, and its products led the world. As I conclude, let me return to the question at hand. When a city chooses to promote nostalgia for one era and historical amnesia for another, what is truly lost? Commemoration implies respect and confers dignity. Yet New Bedford's textile past has existed largely as an unwelcome past, perhaps best characterized by what MacDonald refers to as a difficult heritage, due in this case to the loss of the city's economic vitality and a history that is at odds with the inscribed official discourse of place. Such selective memory is a betrayal of the past. Shunning the textile era shuns an era of workers whose lives hold historical relevance. New Bedford is, after all, a city that was built not only by architects, mill engineers, and industrialists, it was also built and operated by waves upon waves of immigrants, many of whom were women. Efforts by heritage stewards over the years to deny their contributions reflect the problematic relationship of this country with immigration, something that is part of the cultural dialogue today with its exclusionary attitudes about who are the rightful Americans. The reluctance of the historic preservation apparatus to tell diverse histories is reflected in the paucity of National Register of Historic Places listings or National Historic Landmark designations that would allow for a greater understanding of the lived experiences of various social and ethnic minority communities, or even designating sites associated with women, both widely acknowledged to be less than 10%. While it would be proper, therefore, for New Bedford to adjust its urban narrative to celebrate such industrial milestones as George Corliss's pioneering work in steam power at Wamsutta Mills numbers 4 and 5, might it begin to recognize as well the social dynamics of place by honoring its diverse labor force of textile workers? It may not seem to be a grand history, but it is a balanced history, and more importantly, it would be a more authentic representation of the city's heritage. In doing so, New Bedford's mill housing can take its place alongside the mansions of the mill magnates that are celebrated traditionally for their aesthetic significance and as representation of New Bedford's genteel past. In fact, as markers of social identity and attendant power relations, both the mansions and the mill housing can only be understood in terms of each other, just as the factories cannot be fully understood apart from the social and physical context of its workers' housing. This perspective, of course, requires a shift in the lens through which we view such settings, from the prominent emphasis on the physical fabric to its embodiment of cultural heritage as well. This broader context is what colonial Williamsburg historian Carrie Carson refers to as seeking cultural wholes, capturing the interrelatedness of how a society truly functions at all levels of culture. This is the humanist wing of historic preservation that increasingly is gaining momentum. As I have posited elsewhere, buildings alone do not make place. People, in their interrelationship with the natural and built environment, make place. I'm looking forward to actually seeing Lewis Nelson's edited volume coming out on looking at the African American lifeways on the campus of University of Virginia in this regard. What strategies might be implemented? Antoinette Lee puts it succinctly. History is malleable. It can be written, rethought, reinterpreted, resuscitated to illuminate contemporary challenges. The National Park Service, in line with its recent Preservation 50 Diversity Initiative, has been effective in telling a more inclusive history in their Communities of Whaling installation in the Visitor Center for the New Bedford Whaling National Historical Park. Here, a wide spectrum of workers from ship to shore are represented. This museum installation is part of an historic district that includes a 13-block area related to the city's maritime past. Basically, the center of the city, exclusive of its mills. It is time for the National Park Service to continue to adjust the cultural perceptions of the city by offering an alternative narrative that also honors New Bedford's textile heritage and helps visitors to understand who made up the textile workforce and what they did on the shop floor within the complex system of industrial production. Recent efforts have been made on the part of the New Bedford Whaling Museum to represent a more inclusive urban history. The museum's highly successful venues, such as the 2014 NEH-sponsored event, The River and the Rail, a symposium on enterprise and industry in New Bedford, and its exhibit the following year that was almost entirely on industry, led to the latest double-theme issue on New Bedford in industrial archaeology, sadly represented only by the images of whales on its cover. Another issue presents itself. The wholesale demolition of the city's mills is a tragedy. Many of us struggle to save one building that embodies historical significance, but industrial settings such as the former 1888 Wamsutta Mills and its model workers' housing, designed by the Boston architectural firm Wheelwright and Haven, with the assistance of landscape architect Warren Manning, mill complexes can have as many as 6 annexes on its industrial site, constituting large swatches of the urban fabric. When demolished, they create neighborhood dislocation in their huge voids of open land. Where once local citizens lived in the shadow of walls of mills that provided their livelihood, empty lots remain. These mills are deeply ingrained in the very fabric of the city, as well as being embedded in the mental geography of its citizens. But saving mills is no easy task. Michael Steinitz of the Massachusetts Historical Commission offered a sobering note to me during a recent conversation. He states, while the desire for any job-creating development is very strong in the city with regard to adaptive use strategies, local support for long-abandoned and degraded industrial building stock is far from universal, particularly in adjacent residential neighborhoods where removing of large, blighted building complexes is seen as a positive by reducing fire and vandalism threats. Repurposing mills for affordable housing serves one important social need. 3 former mills currently serve this purpose in New Bedford. But apart from the rehabilitation process, it does little to bring back permanent employment. A better solution is what happened when investment tax credits and other incentive packages brought one clean industry back to New Bedford, the Joseph Abboud Manufacturing Corporation. The firm, located in the former 1909 Nashawena Spinning Mill, currently employs 800 workers in a new rooftop solar generation facility that provides 70% of its electricity rather than the coal-fed boiler houses and later fuel oil that once powered it. More than a nostalgic effort to save the mills for their own sake, this is compatible use and enlightened development worthy of emulation. Nostalgia can pull us homeward through comfortable reverie, but it can also distract us from present concerns. As stewards of cultural heritage, the past is our domain, but it is most valuable when it can propel us forward. It is hoped that this greater awareness of the city's textile era will lead to preservation efforts in the form of new listings of historic mill districts, various forms of educational outreach through historic site markers and mapping, and investment tax credits to reuse the remaining mills as vital job generators, along with their residential correlate, the three-decker flats, that glaringly represent the other New Bedford. Thank you for the privilege of your time. I guess I can take questions.
Yeah, we have a few minutes for questions.
I stunned you to silence. Yes.
Do you think that the trend that you're talking about and the... Hello, can you hear me? Okay. Do you think that the trend that you're talking about at the turn of the 20th century of focusing on that first era of whaling and the complete ignorance of the textile heritage had longer reaching effects in New Bedford? So it's struggled since World War II and the same kinds of things with single industry. Do you think that that had any part to play in New Bedford today?
I think it is. There's kind of an embarrassment when you have an industry that is so visually omnipresent and they're just these empty hulks of business, and you sense a failure. And somehow it is very difficult to go and want to trumpet its heritage. For example, there are all of these commemorative items that you can buy in the city. I'm wearing my father's old tie from the 1960s with that image of the whaleman on the tie. Yet there's nothing that you can purchase in the city on the textile era. Nothing about the mills. There were 3 commemorative statues that were, and one is wonderful. I want to make a t-shirt just to be able to celebrate both the textiles and whalings. It was 1914, and it's right as one goes into the Buttonwood Park, designed in 1895 by Olmsted, and Elliott. They did a lot of work in New Bedford. And it shows the whalemen and women at the very foundation of New Bedford's lifeways. And above it, a blacksmith with a huge anvil and the gears of industry next to him. And it actually celebrates the fact in 1914 that out of this great whaling city came a leading manufacturing center. So at that point, things were good. There was a great deal of money to be made. I think 2 things also come in, is that the earlier textile mills up to the 1890s, before the Depression, were all owned locally. So this was part of their heritage. And then after the Depression, most of the mills, not all of them, were being funded by outside investors. So the huge exponential growth in the number of mills didn't really represent New Bedford's own heritage. These were outsiders. And so you combine that with the immigrants, were clearly not local. You began to see that textiles were not something that were part of the favorable heritage that needed to be sponsored. The other aspect is that whaling is pretty unique as an enterprise, and other than Nantucket and the whaling museums down in Connecticut, Mystic Seaport, it's a story that is very interesting as part of the American drama that textiles just does not have. But thanks for your question. Richard.
Well, just to follow up on that issue you just brought up, there's also the rediscovery of Moby Dick.
Oh, yes, in the 20s.
I mean, the novel we all know today was totally unknown
Yeah.
up until the 1920s, when all of a sudden it becomes a great American novel.
Yeah, it was tucked away, the manuscript, in Yale's library under, I think, fish. And all of a sudden it became popular, and the public imagination just absorbed it. I was still living in New Bedford in 1959 when the world premiere of Moby Dick took place. And they had the beard contest, and they went through town, and then they showed this movie. And John Huston, who was the producer, and Gregory Peck were in the back of the audience. Nobody noticed. They were transfixed by this film. And whaling is dramatic, but what is so weird about it is that it was not romantic. It was only romantic to the ship owners and the captains who made all the money, but the seamen who were out struggling and losing their lives, this was not a good job. But nonetheless, it's captured our popular imagination. Yeah,
I loved your presentation, and
Thank you.
I'm really struck by the parallels I'm seeing between kind of the reprocessing of narratives that we see here in some of the Confederate statues.
Absolutely.
And it's not just nostalgia, but also a political utility of that retelling of the narrative, saying, that was the same time like the Racial Integrity Act happened here, and there was very much a conscious effort to say who belongs here and who doesn't. And I'm wondering if you could speak if there are really parallels between this kind of Yankee, nostalgic maleness that's kind of represented by the Yankee and the same thing that's happening with kind of Confederate figures, or was happening in that same era with Confederate figures here, if it had kind of a political dimension.
Well, it certainly did. Nostalgia, I think the way I identify it is this comfortable looking backward in a highly selective way, in a highly exaggerated way, to tell the story of a cultural identity that is part of the consensus of a certain group of people. But they are cultural markers representing not just events, but deep attitudes that are still held today. And not all of it is, a matter of fact, of divisiveness. A lot of it is the issue of who came from the South, who in fact had leadership positions, who were trained in West Point, who were ultimately fighting for their own cultural survival and identity. So it's a dicey issue. I teach at University of Oregon, and I show those pictures in class in New Orleans of taking those statues down, and I ask my students how they feel about it. And there is no clear response, because part of it deals with commemoration, but part of it also deals with where that commemoration is situated. If it's situated in a public forum, it tends to take on the representation of that body. So all of a sudden, it suggests that all of a state capital or a university is embracing one particular point of view. Putting it in a different context, whether it's in a cemetery or whether it is in a museum setting, is another issue. I like to be able to see multiple narratives that tell a broader story, that doesn't just present the attitudes of 1904 or 1914 that created the statue. But what other story could we say that is relevant to today, and it speaks for the people who aren't represented in that statue? Then we're doing history a benefit. And to me, we had the same problem with Dee Hall, one of our two national landmarks on campus, because Dee, who ultimately got the funding to be able to build Oregon University of Oregon, came from Maryland. And though he had no background in slavery, when he was in the state government, was trying to be able to support what was already the law of the land related to slavery. As people came into the Oregon Territory, they could leave there as, they could come in as free people, but had to leave in 2 years. This is 1857. So he's dealing with a cultural situation that hadn't really been decided nationally. So we have to be able to balance the fact that what did he contribute? Because he was very good at being able to make sure that the Chinese abuses to Chinese workers in the 1870s was not tolerated. He also made sure that the first woman attorney in Oregon was allowed to practice and set new things in motion. So you've got to be able to see people in terms of the cultural forces at play, and this is what history is all about. It's not just simply taking something at face value. When we talk about the new architectural history, it's one that deals with context. Still study these buildings as important aesthetic items, but what is the larger narrative that's related to it? And who else was part of this? You know, buildings and landscapes are collective social acts. They're not just done by one group of people that we often herald in our textbooks. And that's becoming more and more the kind of papers that we see, the books that are being written, the kinds of attitudes that make students seeing themselves in the historical narrative of academia and of our country. And I think that's the turning point that we're beginning to see, the new architectural history, the new social history that happened 30 years ago. What else? I know you architecture students, you got out of studio and you're hungry. Anything else? What do you got in here? Or you can get me